again, right? So I think this is definitely like I think to me it's a special event, right? I think, and not necessarily in a good way. So I think if you look at the way how a tiny being has managed to crumble the fundamentals of civilization, I think this is particularly like a special time, and I can really I can be very empathetic, like with respect to the challenges that we face basically as a leader in order to still manage to keep the motivations of the team and also to make them to remain productive at this time of pandemic, right? So my name is Syafri. I'm from Gojek, so from Gojek Data Science. So I'll talk a little bit about the kind of like the meta part of about this whole AI universe, right? So I usually give like technical talks. So I'm actually very passionate about this topic myself because this is really about the soft part of the whole AI, which can become can actually be overlooked sometimes by people, right? So here's how I'm going to do it. So I'll tell a little bit about Gojek maybe very briefly, and then I will basically tell you how I would characterize a high-performing team, and then how basically we can achieve these high-performing teams. And I think I will basically divide it into two aspects of that. So I will share some of the practices at Gojek in terms of like how we organize our people, and then also about like how we organize the work. Okay, so Gojek in a couple of sentences, right? So Gojek is an on-demand app actually. So currently we have 20 plus services. We are now live in Thailand, Vietnam, Singapore, and in Indonesia. So in all major cities in Southeast Asia. And then currently we have around 2 million driver partners actually, right? So if you think about it, it's not nothing because like if you think about it, like 1% of the almost 1% of Indonesian populations actually depends their like a daily income actually to us. So it's such a pleasure, particularly for me, to be able to kind of like work with such a scale. So yeah, it is for me, it's a pleasure itself. Now allow me to tell a little bit about the data science team that we have at Gojek. So the team itself, it's a team of like 50, 60 people. The team is distributed across several countries. So we have a big team in Singapore, like that basically deals with marketplace. We have also like a team in Bangalore that basically which is responsible with the search system that we have at Gojek for GoFood. We also have a team in international, like in Thailand actually, which are dealing basically with the technology related to the merchants, right? So it's a distributed team. And it has become like a challenge on itself, like how to keep this team motivated. So in terms of background as well, so there is a various background. So we have econometricians, we have academicians, we also have like astrophysics actually in the team. We have around like 11 to 12 nationalities within the team. So it's a very challenging in a way itself, like how to manage this team, like moreover, because they're all distributed remotely, right? So maybe I'll go to the next, right? How would I characterize a high-performing team? So when you think about it, so the way I characterize the high-performing teams, I would actually highlight three aspects, right? So first of all, they need to be impactful. And what I meant by that is like there needs to have a high leverage in the sense that the dollar generated or saved using the AI products that they've created, it needs to be like proportions to the head cost count. It needs to be very high, right? Because it basically ensures like a high leverage product. And these are all very like quantifiable metric because we have an experimentation system really integrated into productions. We really know we can quantify in a precise dollar how much actually impact that a certain team drive. Yeah, so that's in terms of like the leverage. And the second characterizations, I would say that the team needs to be very agile. And what I meant by that is that the time to market for AI products to be shipped should be as short as possible, right? So the philosophy that we would like to adopt, particularly in running the team, is that we want to be able to reduce the frictions to ship this AI product. So as much as possible, we want to be able to automate all the bookkeeping activities as such that the team can be very agile and they can be actually be very, they can actually ship products in a short amount of time. And the third thing, I do believe that for a high-performing teams, they need to be empowered, right? What I meant by that is that particularly the team needs to be empowered to fail fast and to be able to learn from it. And they should not be afraid of making mistakes, because that's just part of the learning itself. So that's kind of the philosophy that we believe. And the second, they also need to be encouraged to make decisions, right, in a centralized manner. And luckily for us, like working in the data space, data can actually be seen as a catalyst for decentralized decision making, right? Because instead of like always going to your managers in order to make a certain decisions, you can just hyper experiment on a lot of things, and based on that experiment, you can actually choose whether you want to go left or right. So I think those are the three characterizations for a high performing team, right? So they need to be impactful, they need to be agile, and they need to be empowered. The questions then, how are we going to achieve like this characterization in a team, right? So I would like to see it from two perspectives, actually. So first, I'm gonna share some of the thought about like how we can achieve that from the organization of the people itself. That's one aspect. And the second aspect will be how to achieve that by the way we organize our our work, right? So I think those are the two aspects that I want to highlight over here. So let me go to the first one. So I'll share some of the thoughts about how to organize for the people itself in order to achieve this high performance team, right? And particularly in the remote setting, which kind of like being pushed to us because of this pandemic. So there are a couple of things that we believe, right? So we believe that we need to organize the team itself for speed, because although like the team is actually growing and will becomes bigger and bigger, we also fundamentally think that this startup spirit needs to be there. So we definitely need to be organized around speed, right? What does that mean, actually? How does that translate into like a concrete and tangible strategy? So number one is like we organize our people by goals, but not really by functions, right? And advantage of that, because that's actually would reduce the complexity. So like if you can basically, so I will also introduce the notion of the composable architecture by basically looking at your teams as a surface in a way that you can actually compose, that you can stitch together in order to achieve a certain goal, right? And the reason for that, why does that work, is because if you look at for example, the iteration cycle between engineering team, product engineering team, and data scientists, they have a very different pattern in terms of like how they iterate on some certain product, right? So typically for product engineering teams, they work in sprints, basically. They pivot really fast. While for data scientist team, because there are a lot of like data dependencies, it's kind of like a bit very powerful, but you need to think of it like a ship, basically a container ship, right? You just need to nudge them to a certain directions, but they can't really pivot very fast because a lot of dependencies, particularly on the data. And the advantage actually of organizing, so basically how we do it, right? Suppose that we have a certain problem statement that we want to solve. Suppose that we say we want to basically solve the allocation problem. And what I meant by that, like is an example, like how to basically allocate certain orders to certain drivers. Like the way we do it is like we try to decompose the problem statement. What are the different components that we need to build? And then once those components has been identified, we can actually organize the team around it. So the team here is a very fluid concept, right? So people can actually be in a different team like X weeks later, just because of the fact that we think that's the best way to approach a problem. So it's not a very like a carved in stone concept, right? And we also believe that the limit of the team, it needs to be very small, right? So we have these 2 pizza rules from Amazon. It's a max 12 people definitely in the team. And then in order for them to empower them, like in the way they organize themselves, we also need to give them a tenets. So tenets is basically like a principle or belief. Like this will be used by them in order to make a decisions actually in an independent way. Because sometimes if you think about it, like a lot of blockers for a product to be shipped very fast is just basically in the way decision makings are being structured, right? So by giving the team tenet, empower them to make a decisions, we're really gonna basically, particularly on the agility aspect, we can actually push that to the next level of curve, right? What we also believe is the concept of fungible people, right? So we believe that every member of the teams, every member of the data scientist team, they need to be very fungible in the sense that they need to be end-to-end. So they need to know how to do the data ingestions. They need to know how to basically talk to the business in order to be able to translate the business requirements into a data science. They need to frame it as a data scientist problem. Data science problems in this case. But they also need to be able to for example, do proper research. They need to be able to crunch papers and then creating a POC, and then all the way up to the deployment, right? So what we believe is that we believe in a T profile, so in the T-shaped profile for basically the member of the teams. They need to be very swappable, right? Because of the fact that they should be able to deal with like end-to-end development of an AI product. So what I mean by T profile is that at bare minimum, they need to have a basic understanding of the end-to-end development cycle of an AI product, but they also need to, they can actually choose a specialization. Because with that specialization, that becomes their identity actually, right? As such that people will be able to leverage for from those specialization. So number two, I'll make it very fast. So it's about like how we organize the work that we do. So a couple of things, right? So number one, we take documentation very, very serious. In the sense that, like particularly like the services, right? When I gave the analogy earlier that if you want to solve a certain problems, you first need to decompose it into kind of particular subcomponents, and then each of the subcomponent actually becomes a product, becomes a data product on itself. So it needs to have a proper SLA, it needs to have a proper documentation, it needs to have a proper maintenance. So basically, we consider that as a product, and documentation, in this case, plays a very important role because that's the only way you can actually pass knowledge from different people, even to the new joiners of the team, right? So we also ensure that we have a proper confluence, discoverable confluence. So for example, if a certain person wants to know how a particular service is being created, they can actually Google that very quickly, right? And also what we also adopt is actually like API first principle, as such that everybody can basically iterate their own API very quickly, and then basically they gather a little bit later. So how it works really is that typically we have an inception meeting where we basically decompose the problems and then determine the subcomponent, defining the software contract between each of these components, how they communicate to each other, and then each of the team can do the iteration by themselves, like at their own speed. And then at a predefined time, the team will basically gather together and then do the integration part. So that will basically allows us to deconstruct the complexity, because I think in most cases, the type of problems that we dealt with are very, very complex. Particularly if you look at the like a ride-hailing company, it's basically a complex interaction of different signals, if you may say. So it's very complex in nature. So like breaking it down into services and components are very important, right? And then that's also the reason why we think that the documentation of API needs to be very clear, because that's basically the binding between like a contract between one team with another team, basically. So that's number one. And number two, what we also basically tell the team is that we kind of like want to ingrain the concept of incremental delivery, kind of like a mindset, right? So the team itself, what they need to do is like every week they need to ship something. It needs to be something very tangible. It can be a report, for example. It can be an RFC. It can be like a PRD. But the mentality that we kind of like to use is that everyone in the like everybody in a particular teams, they need to deliver something. They need to really like do some incremental delivery, right? So we need to break down the big deliveries into small chunks, basically, and then like really deliver on those a small chunk as much as possible. And the third things that I want to share is basically the notions of the composable architecture that I mentioned before. So we are very obsessed with automation. So the way we do our work, as much as possible, like all the bookkeeping things, it needs to be automated, right? As an example, we have a product called Merlin. So this is a ML platform product. So it used to be when we want to deploy a ML algorithm, right? It takes a very long time because you need to take care of the infrastructures. You need to like register the VM clusters in like in a non-conflicting ways. So many things need to be taken care. But what we did is that we create an abstraction of deployment. So for data scientists there, what a data scientist need to do. So the only thing that they need to do is basically they save their pickle file or like a TensorFlow model into a certain folder, and with a CLI, basically they can deploy a model in a scalable manner within just like 10 minutes. right? So that's a Merlin, right? And then that system also will be able to deploy that in a scalable infrastructure like Kubernetes, also with their logging system and monitoring system. So we try to abstract away all of this bookkeeping stuff from us. And yeah, and I think the last thing, let me look at the time. So we want to basically leave some time as well for Q&A, I suppose. So I'll just wrap it very quickly. What we also try to do is we try to embrace the asynchronous ways of working, right? So, for example, the way we do stand-up, is very asynchronously because a team actually works in a different time zone. So we can't really do sometimes like a live stand-up. So we do it things in a very asynchronous ways. We adopt silent meetings as well, especially when it's a big meeting. So we come together in a room. We just basically sit down there for 1 hour, and we are kind of like commenting a certain doc together. And the kind of the advantage of that, because we don't need to wait for a particular person to finish talking before we can actually actively doing things, right? So it's very interesting ways of doing meeting actually, and we found it to be very effective in managing the asynchronous works particularly. And the third thing regarding the asynchronous work is that we also adopt Asana as a project management tool. And this is very nice because this is actually being adopted by the whole company. So you can actually map out the dependencies as well between each of these different deliverables, right? Because again, like creating AI product, it needs to be integrated with the production, with the product system in a way. So we need to be very good at synchronizing the release cycle of a product, for example. Yes. So let me see. Do you still have time, by the way, or shall I open for Q&A?
You could take more time if you'd like. And also there is a question from the audience. So whenever you're ready, I'm ready with the queue to ask you that question.
Perfect. So allow me maybe to spend like 2-3 minutes to kind of wrap it up, right? So I think what I came to learn during my tenure at Gojek, right, is that the source of complexity of, especially when we want to kind of create a high-performing team, a lot of complexity is actually around people. When you work on a complex system, and we are very every day we constantly think about how do we reduce the interdependencies between people in a way as such that people can actually iterate faster at their own pace. So yeah, if you can basically disentangle that, you can already one step closer to creating a high performance AI team. And I think the second things that I want to kind of take away is the idea of a composable architecture, right? So not only that you can apply the same principles for the technology stack, but also the way you organize the people as well. And the ideas of this composable architecture, again, if I need to reiterate again, is the idea that you see that the output of a certain team as a service, right? You need to have for example, you need to create a multiple service that you can actually compose very quickly if you want to be able to deliver or solve a certain problem, right? As an example, I've shown already, we have created a product called Feast. So the only thing that Feast does is actually managing the feature store. We have a Merlin, which basically specializes in the model deployment. We also have, for example, for experimentations, we have a service that can generate some, let's say, unbiased population. And it also takes care, for example, the fact that experimentation will not mix to each other. So by being able to decompose all these team as a subcomponents, right, that they can interact with each other, you can actually create the agility that you need, right? Yeah, I think that those are my things that that I want to us to take away from this presentation. Yeah, maybe let's go to the Q&A.
Yes, absolutely. So thank you so much. Well, there is one question which one of our delegates has asked. Syafri he wants to know, how does Gojek guarantee their customer data privacy? And does Gojek use the data for other purposes beside for its internal core business? It's addressed to you by Mujiono.
Oh, okay, interesting. No, it's actually not very relevant with the topic, but it's fine. I can answer that. So I think definitely it's a very standard practice. I think we take data seriously, and especially for a company with the size of Gojek, we need to be very responsible with the type of data and how we share data, right? So we have a very we have a very tight, actually, like a data governance policy in place, and also like to protect that privacy. Like recently, we hired a CSO, basically, right? So just to make sure that in terms of like a data security, it gets the right attention. And then also we have a proper like a data governance, like a data models, even basically just as an example, just to give some colors and flavors to that. Every field that we have in the table, right? Like you actually need to determine the right access on field level. Just kind of an example of those little details that we kind of like do in order to be able to ensure that the privacy of the data privacy of consumers are being protected. And I think number two, the question is about do we use it for internal, right? Yeah, I think it's only mainly for internal at this moment. So the data that we do, we don't share basically. So yeah, I hope that answered the questions.
Sure. Also, just one more thing. Aditya says, very nice presentation that resonates with what we experience in the trenches. The question is, how do you start implementing this when you have impedance mismatch with some parts of organizations that is very regulated, rigid, or old-fashioned? Could you comment on that just as a conclusion, please?
Oh, sorry, could you please repeat again?
How do you start implementing this when you have an impedance mismatch with some parts of your organization?
What mismatch? Impedance?
Impedance.
Impedance mismatch. Okay. Yeah. So basically, the way we kind of resolve this, right? And I think it's a very, and I think that's a very good question actually that you raised it, because I think a lot of like conflicts typically start with like a mismatch in the way expectation management, right? So what we really do before the start of every activities and every project is that we have a very clear DARSI in place. So DARSI is basically stand for decider, like accountable, responsible, and informed, right? So who's really eventually the final decider, and we have ensured that there is one single accountability in each of the projects that we do, each of the products and deliverables that we do. We also have a like a responsible and informed structure, right? As such that when there's some mismatch in impedance, actually, you can actually have like a good escalation point that you can actually follow eventually in order to resolve that conflict. Because essentially, again, the decision fatigue is can actually like slow down the delivery, right? So it's some cases it's better to make a decision very fast, like semi-optimal decisions rather than not making decisions at all. So I think that's how we kind of like try to tackle that. So we create a very good escalation route, very clear expectation setting at the beginning of every project that we do, just to ensure that all different parties are very clear about what's expected of them by when.
Sure. So thank you so much, Syafri. There are a couple more questions from Shaheen and Moyono, but then we're not going to be able to take it in the interest of time. But once again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks everyone. Have a nice day.
Thank you.